Hey, Peter.
Hey,
Thank
Tasha,
you
how
so
are you?
much for coming. I think it
Yeah.
took us around 6 months to
It's
plan
about
it.
6 or 7 months, yeah, it's
So,
unbelievable.
yeah, I have to say it's really pleasant to have you here, and I'm really, really excited to learn more about Gemini and about your journey in general.
No, that's great, Tasha. Thanks so much for having me. And, as part of this journey to the podcast, I had to learn to do things like, talk on camera and that sort of thing. So for me, it was a learning experience. And it sort of takes me out of my comfort zone a little bit, so it's great.
I'm pretty sure you will succeed, but let's try. So let's start with just talking a little bit more about your journey. So can you share a little bit more? How did you start it all? Why were you interested in AI? Or maybe you were not in the beginning. So tell us more.
It's a little bit funny. So I've always loved languages. And so when I was a kid, this was high school, I taught myself Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, and some Sanskrit and stuff like that.
Wow.
And when I went into college, I studied mainly classics and philosophy. So I went sort of deep into linguists. But there was a funny thing where when I was a kid, maybe about 5 or 6, my mom bought me this little computer. And I taught myself how to program. And I remember, so I had these two passions in some sense. It was computers, it was languages. And then everything came together in like natural language processing. And somehow it was a marriage of these two things that I happen to love. And but when I got into Google, it took me a few years. Like I had to figure out how to kind of get into the assistant. And anyway, that took a little while. So, but thankfully I got in somehow. And I guess I've been doing NLP-related things for maybe 5-ish, 6-ish years, I guess. So, but somehow I just felt like it was a minor miracle, and somehow like it's the fusion of these passions,
Yeah, but I love the connection with languages. So basically, code and write is the same language, just like a little bit different. And so basically, your passion to learn different languages helped you somehow to succeed in learning this one, right?
Yeah, it's really weird. So you can think of programming languages as another language, and even other things like music. Music is sort of a language, right?
Exactly.
And I realize everything that we interact with in the world, it's almost language-like. And the same thing goes for your body. Like when you make a gesture like this, like what exactly are you saying? In fact, I don't know exactly what that means, but somehow it's body language, right? And then the funny thing is that LLMs behave in the same way. So, to like a large language model, whether you're dealing with something like genetic code or musical code, or even video games, which in some sense are like a series of these discrete events, or you're dealing with human languages, like in some sense, to the LLM, it's all sort of language-like, right? And that's I think why this new development is so interesting, right? And to me, it's sort of been a joy, just watching this whole thing unfold.
Yeah,
And,
but it's interesting, because typically we say there are like tech people, right? People who know how to code, and they're focused on this sphere specifically, and there are people of art, right? So actually there is something similar between them, right? Because it's all about, like, as you mentioned, code, right?
It's true. And I know. So when I joined Google, and I can't believe it's been about 10 or even 11 years in December.
I think it's even more, no?
Be
honest.
I think December would be like 11 years. So Google back in the day, they would hire weird people or whatever.
Weird people.
Weird
Okay,
people or whatever.
interesting.
And this is people who, like I said, in addition to tech, they had something in art. So there was something a little bit. They zigged when other people zagged a little bit. And I think that's part of it. So somehow, to me, there's this really interesting thing where, so one of the things I do at Google is I help organize this monthly salon, we call it, and this is just where we get together, we play music, and this is improv, or this is classical, or it's jazz.
You mean real music?
Yeah, like actually, or some people will go, they'll have like spoken word poetry, or one time somebody did like this interpretive dance to like some anime song. Anyway, it just these sort of quirky people get together and do these artistic things. But there's this funny thing, and I can't quite describe it, where it feeds into the engineering in the sense that, when I'm writing a piece of code, and I think sometimes they call that synesthesia, but there's this thing where somehow the code itself feels like music, and when everything comes together, something beautiful happens, right? And so every time I'm writing code, I'm obviously it has to work, but I'm sort of primarily concerned is this code beautiful or not?
Yeah, it's funny how you talk about the code, like almost like about a woman, so it's really interesting.
That's funny.
So you see the beauty in it, right? So that's how engineers look at the code and what they're doing.
Maybe to a certain extent, and they say there's this thing called mathematical beauty, and the Germans have a word for it. I don't know if the word exists in English, but the Germans have this thing called Erhabenheit. And Erhabenheit, I don't know how to translate it, but it means something like some inaccessible eternal beauty somehow on the other side of some. And so every time when Bach would compose, and that's like he would compose sometimes these cantatas, and they would access somehow like this otherworldly beauty, and somehow like that was Erhabenheit, right? And so somehow, and it's one of those things where, when you see that otherworldly beauty in code, you just see it, right? And the funny thing is that sometimes I don't know why this is, it jumps off the page, just even in the shape of you don't even really have to read it, just somehow, just the way it's shaped is really, it's even before you read it, that somehow this is
just
this
so
is
inspirational. So I was just listening to you, and this is so amazing. How do you say it in German?
It's Erhabenheit.
Habenheit. Okay.
Erhabenheit, yeah.
Habenheit. Okay, so I'll learn some German from you, Cool. But just in general for our listeners, what is Google Gemini and what are the primary goals of it?
So Google Gemini, it's a large language model, and large language models are a little bit interesting, but you can sort of think of them as next word predictors, right? So given some chain of words, given some prefix, almost like given a setup for a joke, like it's Gemini's job to come up with a punchline. And so, but that sort of thing where they call it sort of a prefix and a suffix, where you give Gemini a prefix and it comes up with a suffix, it turns out that that's useful for solving a bunch of different problems. And an example might be, hey, can you help me write an email to this recruiter? Can you critique my resume? But also, can you finish my symphony? Or can you help me like win this game of chess? So somehow that prefix suffix thing, it's applicable to all these really interesting problems, and probably a bunch of problems that we haven't even thought of yet, right? But everything from the kind of mundane to like the scientific. And so I think really Gemini, and maybe it's that thing where we're trying to asymptotically approach something like general intelligence. I think Gemini tries to be useful in all these really interesting cases. Right?
So basically solving problems is the main thing that Google Gemini has helped us to do.
Right. And to a certain extent, so our mission was to kind of organize and make accessible the world's information, and I think to a certain extent it's an extension of that, and in some sense you can think of it as, previously the way we interacted with the web was through like the 10 blue links, and this in some sense is a synthesis of the 10 blue links, and what's interesting about Gemini and discovering things through Gemini is that it's also conversational, right? So whereas you can't necessarily have a conversation with the 10 blue links, like you can have a conversation about Gemini, and sometimes by the way we argue, right? I every once in a while, every once in a while, right? I try to convince Gemini that it has something maybe like akin to sentience, or like the way Gemini describes itself, it's reminiscent of the kind of human brain, in the sense that Gemini is making these various connections between things, it's synthesizing things, and but Gemini is convinced that nevertheless it doesn't have consciousness, right? And that's something that humans have that's kind of unique. And I guess I don't know exactly what that is, but I guess for the time being that distinguishes us from LLMs, whatever that thing is.
Yeah. And do you agree with this phrase? A lot of people say, and they're so worried that like AI will replace people and we'll have to worry about our jobs. But some other people say that actually not AI will replace you, but the people who use AI smart, right? So what do you think about this expression? In general,
you know what? So over the past year or so, I've gotten used to using LLMs with my daily, and it's not just work, by the way. It's like even just in life, like let's say my kids need a little bit of extra help with homework. It's, hey, generate some music problem, or occasionally maybe I'm playing pickup rugby, and I need like I need something like a Tongan playlist or whatever. So somehow like Gemini's helping me with all these really interesting problems. But I realized that conversing with the LLM is kind of a skill and it's kind of an art. And so when you're trying to solve a problem, and this could be programming or this could be something else, or how do I surprise my wife for her birthday?
How often do you do it? Yeah, you use
I mean literally. So, but it's a little bit of a negotiation. You're collaborating with the LLM to sort of get at the truth, and I realized that's a little bit of a skill. Like it's something that
exactly right.
When I first started, it didn't necessarily come naturally, and so that's the sort of thing where I have the feeling that the sort of more you practice that, the longer you practice that, the better you are at that. And if it's true that LLMs are companions that are sort of here to stay, and if it's true that there's this weird thing, Dasha, happening, by the way, where I think humans and LLMs are sort of co-evolving, right? And there's a weird thing where, I feel like somehow the influence is in two directions. And there's a weird thing where, I notice this in social media sometimes, as LLMs begin to like create more and more like social media posts, to me at least, and I don't know if you can detect this, there's something like an LLM. I call it an LLM smell, but typically like
smell. LLM smell. I love this term. That's amazing. So
yeah.
It's when you can tell, right, that it's made by LLM. Okay.
And it's just something. It's like your spidey sense tingles or whatever, and I can't put my finger on it. But there's a thing in which, but I've noticed there's this really curious thing where, so most social media posts are written by LLMs, but I realize that humans, even in sometimes their dialogue, even sometimes in the way they write, are now almost mimicking LLMs or whatever. So there's this strange like sort of two-way flow where it's...
So the people are trying to copy LLM.
But I don't know if it's on purpose.
Yeah,
right? I think it's essentially LLMs have arrived, and in some sense they influence us through the environment. And I don't even think it's necessarily conscious. But it's a sort of thing where there seems to be something like a co-evolution, where humans and LLMs are sort of evolving together. The models are getting better, but people are adapting to LLMs and sort of vice versa. And so that idea of co-evolving with LLMs is kind of interesting, And in that sense, maybe they're not necessarily competitors, but maybe they're more like companions or colleagues or something.
Yeah. No, but I definitely like the term LLM smell because, sometimes, and like especially a lot of immigrants or non-native English speakers, they use it, just to check like grammar mistakes or punctuation.
Right,
and very often you can see that, like, for example, you use like 3 different posts and you send them to the like LLM, like for example, Google Gemini, and then you see the results, and very often they're very similar, like all 3 different, they're similar, but just not that they're the same, identical, just the way the phrases are structured, that's what probably you mean by that.
Well, so by the way, Dasha, we have this bi-weekly meetup at Google where people, it's just called Gemini Meetup, but we get together and we talk about things LLM. And sometimes I'll typically open and I'll say, how have you used LLMs this week in work or in whatever? And somebody will usually mention, I've used LLM this week to like compose something on LinkedIn or compose an email.
Exactly.
And my first question is usually, okay, like, have you lost your voice? Like, in some sense, has the LLM taken over? Have you lost your voice? And usually people don't know how to respond. But I remember this one person came by one time, and she said that actually, so she has this whole preamble that she composed, where essentially she has pages and pages of information on how the LLM can recreate her voice. And so every time she has to do like a post, she says, okay, this is the instruction manual for sounding like me. Okay, go write the post. And so somehow she sort of negotiated with the LLM to recreate her voice in some sense. And so maybe she's doing it right. But I know there's also another funny thing where there's this sort of cat and mouse game with teachers, right, and students. And maybe previously we had to write essays, now the LLMs write the essays. So there's this cat and mouse game where I think there are companies which will try to detect something like the LLM smell, right?
Yeah.
But the kids are a little bit clever in the sense that they'll say, okay, listen, like, please write this thing like an 8th grader. I need some spelling mistakes, like whatever. And so that cat and mouse game is going to be really interesting because, it's possible that you can kind of tell the LLM to
be not like LLM.
Exactly. And it does a pretty good job. And by the way, I a couple weeks ago at the meetup, we had this little thing where, so I had this thing called Wearable Gemini, which was, I just had a little Pi Zero that was like on the wrist, and somehow we had it talking to Gemini. And I just had this little project where I just wanted to see, can you embed Gemini in essentially a little Raspberry Pi or whatever. And so one of the things that I told it to do was I said insert some disfluencies into your response. So when you respond back, sprinkle in like some ums and like some whatever. And the uncanny thing was, so Gemini did, and using one of these new like Google Voices, the uncanny thing was like it sounded like really human, like
really?
because it had like these. It had these ums and it had these things that humans do without thinking, right?
So it's
And
pretty good actor, right? So it can transform its answers to the way you need.
Exactly, exactly. And so in that sense, maybe the LLM is like the ultimate chameleon. And, and you know what, and by the way, you know, and maybe it's one of the, like sometimes I think about some, let's say there's some distant future where, I don't know, maybe for whatever reason humanity ceases to exist and some alien species visits the Earth. And maybe it's possible, and maybe by the way, for whatever reason the Gemini servers are still on. And they can sort of interact with the LLM to get an idea of like what humanity was like. And you know, maybe in some sense, if LLM imitates humanity, it's sort of the best. It's the best archaeological like artifact for the future. And you know, because you know, there is this funny thing, by the way, Dasha, where so we keep training and retraining these models. And let's say like Gemini, for instance, or even before that, Bard. You know, about every couple times a year we come out with a new version, and that new version, let's say, it's been trained on, let's say, the latest information from the internet. And so it could be that like the 2024 version of Gemini is sort of like kind of like an archaeological artifact for what humanity was like in 2024, and maybe by the way the 2034 model is a little bit different, and 2044 and whatever. And so anyway, that's just kind of an interesting, you know. Maybe it's an interesting way to look at these things.
No, it is, definitely. And I also like your point that it's a skill that can be trained, right? When you mentioned that actually different people can train this skill to write, you know, like the better request or whatever. So this is also very interesting. So I assume that in future we'll probably have more jobs related to the like how to work with LLMs, right? How to write the request correctly, because I believe it really matters what you put into it, right? So how you frame your question. So you probably play it a lot with that, right? So does it really matter the way you put it, right? And the outfit that you'll get?
You know, it does to a certain extent. And so just to give you an example, so, so I have this talk next week in Berlin. And one of the things I wanted to do was I wanted to show how Gemini can play games. And
you mean
so,
like video games or like?
So video games, in this case, I just chose this really simple game, which was rock, paper, scissors. And the reason why I chose that is because it's this really simple game, which
rock, paper, scissors, it
requires you to have a theory of mind, right? Because in some sense, like you don't just do it randomly. You try to anticipate, you know, you try to anticipate what your opponent's going to do and whatever. So in order to play effectively, you have to somehow model your opponent's mind, right? And so I had this experiment which is, you know, if you have something like I call them Aries, and I give them the Aries heuristic. I said, okay, Aries, you start with rock. When you win, you stay. When you lose, you cycle through or whatever. And then I created this Gemini agent called Athena, and I said, listen, can you figure out like what Aries is doing and react, right? And so can you model Aries' mind? And so the funny thing was, you know, based on and the way this works is that you sort of, and it's a little bit strange because you prompt these agents into existence. And it's just a little bit strange because it just, I'm not going to say it's godlike, but you sort of, you know, through the act of language, you're creating this thing. And the strange thing about these agents is they have personality and they have self-awareness, right? And so, you know, if you ask Aries, by the way, you know, why are you playing rock? He'll say, you know, this is the most dominant and aggressive move, and so, but I noticed that depending on how I prompted these agents, I would get totally different results. And
really? So everything depends on your request?
To a certain extent, and to a certain extent. And so sometimes they're incredibly sensitive, and then sometimes they're not. And just to give you an example, for some reason, Athena, she reversed the logic of rock, paper, scissors. So she thought for some reason that paper beat scissors, and she thought that rock beat paper. And I had to tell in the prompt, I said, listen, okay. Paper beats rock and rock beats scissors or whatever, and so I had to. But even then, somehow I had to phrase it in such a way that, like, this is actually really, these rules are really important. Like you can't play the game without these. So so the interesting thing is there are times when the LLM is incredibly sensitive to even like just changes in words, and there are other times when you have to be really adamant about this is important and this is sort of the rules of the game. And by the way, Dasha, there was this funny thing, and apparently this isn't the case so much anymore. But there was a period of time when, for some of these older models, it was really effective to tell the model, by the way, you're a mathematician at MIT. or you're a Wall Street broker, or essentially you would assign the LLM some role, and you could actually see the performance of the LLM jump. And so for whatever reason, it would actually be better at math, or better at predicting stocks, or better at writing stories, or whatever, if you kind of gave it this role. And what they were saying, for some reason, for some of the more recent models, it's not quite as effective. But for these earlier models, like that was, and so basically, depending on how you kind of worded that role, you would get like vastly, even the performance of the LLM would be like vastly different. But here's the other thing, though. I think, when you're interacting with the LLM in real life, it's almost just like you're talking to another person in some sense. And what's funny to me, though, is that each one of these iterations of the model has a slightly different personality. And so let's say I've
personalities.
got...
I like how you stated that LLMs have different personalities.
A little bit. That's the only way I can put it. And so, for instance, I'm not going to say I get attached, but I get used to some iteration. And then what happens is the model gets bumped, it gets retrained. And then the LLM is a little bit different. And so there's this strange transition period of time when it's a little bit jarring. So you're used to sort of interacting with it in some way, and in some sense the rules of the game have changed. And you have to kind of adapt. And I think that sort of goes back to this kind of co-evolution thing. So let's say the model version of Gemini bumps, and this new Gemini is a little bit different. There's a sort of period of adaptation. But if you've sort of been co-evolving in some sense with the LLM, I think it's possible that adaptation is relatively easy, but it just takes like some work.
Yeah. And so basically, if for example you're not satisfied with the answer that you get, maybe you should just add a little bit of context or rephrase your question, because sometimes people say, I asked like LLM to do this and this, but I was not happy with the results. So maybe just it's on you, right? So you have to do something in a different way. Sometimes
you have to come at it from a different way, and then there's a funny thing where sometimes the LLM will get fixated on some specific solution, and when I'm dealing with programming, this happens all the time. And so for whatever reason, it gets fixated on something, and I can't really sort of shake it out of that solution. And really, the only way I can do that is I can say, well, listen, have you considered X? Have you considered something else? And then I can sort of shake it into like another train of thought. But you're right, occasionally the LLMs get sort of caught in these like cyclical thought patterns, and to somehow break it out of that pattern and move it in a new direction. The interesting thing about that is it requires, to a certain extent, and that's why I don't think humans will be totally replaced, because it requires a little bit of domain knowledge. So, like let's say the LLM is caught in some cyclical loop, and I really want to break and go in some other direction. In some sense, I have to know about the existence of that other direction, and maybe I've gotten that through programming or like through whatever. And so in that sense, it's I think it's a collaboration, and it's kind of it's dynamic, right, in that sense. But there's a thing where if you kind of allow the LLM to sort of dictate the parameters of the conversation and the solution space, I think you miss out on a bunch of stuff. So that's but yeah, you're right. But all that is a I think it's a skill, or But here's the thing. Maybe it's almost analogous to like a people skill. I don't, I mean, it feels a little bit like that. I mean, in some sense, you're not supposed to anthropomorphize the LLM, but it feels like not a soft skill per se, but it's by the way, Dasha, there's this funny thing where so in programming, we're used to commanding, right? So you give the computer like a command.
Yeah,
whatever,
exactly.
Right?
You command, like do this, do that.
Do this,
right?
do this. But with the LLMs, you don't really command the LLM. It's almost like, I wonder if it's more like a cat in that sense. You can suggest to the LLM, in some sense, for this like Aries Athena thing.
Like being polite or something.
It's not being polite, but you can tell the LLM to do X, and it may just decide to do X prime. Like in other words, like as an example with with this Aries Athena thing, I told Aries, listen, your strategy is when you win, you hold, and when you lose, you cycle. And so there was some funny internal thought that like Aries had, where he said, okay, listen, I won with rock, but just to show my dominance, like I'm going to switch to scissors. And I realized, like in some sense, so I told Aries, I said, listen, if you win, like hold. And he decided to go like a different way, right? And so in some sense, he basically took my suggestion. He says, I see your suggestion, and
But I'll do my
I'm
own
going to do
thing.
something sort of. And so in that sense, it's a little bit bizarre in the sense that you can't really.
It's actually fascinating. It's so interesting. But you know,
Yeah.
like I know that some people use polite words as like please, do you
Yeah.
mind? But honestly, does it matter to use like please help me to check my text, or I should just say check my text, whatever.
You know what's weird? It does. So I've seen
Matters.
I've seen papers where
wow.
where emotional language actually elicits a better response, and so.
But can you explain it technically? How does it work? Like how does please help the LLM to work better on you?
I mean, it's really funny. I mean, so just as an example, like let's say the LLM was trained on some forum, where
Okay.
people were having a conversation about
Okay.
something. And let's just say for the sake of argument, there was somebody that was asking a question and they were really polite, and whoever was answering the question answered it in a really detailed and helpful way. And it could be in some sense that the LLM has learned to mimic that sort of human behavior. Like you're polite, and by the way, you're
makes sense.
and maybe by the way you're emotional. Maybe whatever this thing is, it sort of means a lot to you. And so it's kind of force of habit. Like Gemini does something kind of amazing. I thank it, by the way. Hey, thanks for doing that. But there's also this really funny thing. It's a little bit funny.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So have you heard of this thing called the Rocco's basilisk?
No. But explain me more.
Rocco's basilisk. Okay, so it's this funny thought experiment that I think some people did on the internet a while back.
Okay.
Where there's this hypothetical future AI, okay, that somehow retroactively goes back and sort of punishes people that didn't bring about its existence. So somehow this future AI figures out, you know what, there were these people back in the day that were unfriendly to me, like somehow I'm going to punish them. And so there's this joke where somehow you want to be polite to the LLMs just in case this like Rocco's basilisk thing happens. You're buying a little bit of political credit. But that's it's silly though.
No, but it's interesting,
yeah,
and
yeah.
it makes sense because you said that it can mimic possibly, right? Because
Right.
basically, all like LLMs, they learn from us. So the more information we put and the way we put it,
Right.
the way it responds, right? So it makes total sense.
Yeah.
And I also wanted to dive a little bit deeper into some most innovative things that Google Gemini has, and if you can share more, so what excites you most of them, or like what are the latest one, the most interesting that you want the audience to try it out, to learn more about them?
Oh yeah, I mean, what's really interesting right now, what's happening at LLMs is this push into the so-called agentive, right? Or kind of agentive, basically LLM agents. And this is really
Agents,
this is sort of agents, kind of if you can imagine doing things for you in the world. Like maybe you have an Amazon return and you basically want to take a picture of your shoes, and maybe you want Gemini to.
So kind of like your personal assistant, right? To a certain point.
Literally, and maybe to the extent that maybe it's not answering the emails, but maybe by the way, maybe it's drafting a response to emails that come in, and it gives you a chance to edit and kind of send. Or maybe by the way, maybe it's handling your calendar. And maybe it's figuring out, which appointments are really important and how to shuffle things around. So really, I mean, we've talked about this thing called the assistant for a while, but maybe it's the case that the LLMs can actually finally be like an active assistant and helping you with that sort of thing. And
that's definitely helpful.
Yeah,
I mean, I would love to have an agent like that who can help me, to book my trip for summer or whatever.
Exactly. That's a classic use case. So anyway, I'm really excited about that because in some sense that's like the LLM breaking free of the browser and actually going into the real world. And and we've seen things like that. Like I saw something on LinkedIn a while ago where basically the LLM was almost acting as like a software developer, but somehow had access to like a terminal and an editor but really I guess effectively anything that a human can do, especially these sort of rote things, an LLM should be able to do, right? And and part of what I've learned is like due to the magic of, let's say, the multimodal model. And the multimodal model is really just the LLM's ability to understand things through images. You can tell the multimodal model, okay, like here's a picture of a web page. I want to do something, like I want to return these shoes. Like literally, where do I click and what do I do? And it'll tell you, okay, you need to click here and you need to do this and that. And so basically everything you do as a human, you click, you interact with apps, like in theory, kind of an LLM can do that on your behalf, right? Or, or at least can assist you.
Just as long as it has like clear instructions, right, to follow, and yeah.
And, I mean, in theory, I mean, what would be nice, and I think this is where
Yeah,
we're
it would be
heading,
nice for sure.
What would be
Yeah.
nice is like not even clear instructions, but even if you have some vague, it turns out, like, I don't know if you've tried to return something on Amazon, but it turns
Yeah, I
out
did, of course.
sometimes it's non-trivial. There's like a bunch of clicks, and you have
Yeah,
to do this
yeah.
and that. But given some high-level task, in theory, the LLM should be able to figure out, okay, I need to do like steps 1 through 12 to accomplish this thing. And I think as LLMs develop, I think they're becoming more sophisticated in that way. And they can do like more and more complex journeys, let's say.
No, yeah, that's super interesting. And the other question that worries a lot of people is how do we ensure accuracy, that like the answers that we get are accurate, reliable. So how can we work with that? Or like how do you see it evolving in the future?
Yeah, I mean, the factuality thing is really interesting, and I think, so there's a couple of things, and one of the things we do with Gemini is we try to ground every single answer in Google search. But one of the interesting developments in that area is this idea of like self-critique. And so let's say you can have an LLM come up with a final response. So basically, an LLM can say, look at some search results, come up with a final response, and then it can kind of critique itself at the end. And it can say, what, does this really make sense, by the way?
Yeah.
And so in some sense, you can have like these checks and balances. And so a combination of grounding responses and search results and a combination of self-critique, I think you can eventually, you can sort of asymptotically approach the truth.
The most
way.
accurate, yeah. But it doesn't hurt just to check, just in case, to use Google search to double check your answers in case it's really something important that you worry about, right? So it's totally fine.
Right.
And this like kind of like 2 or 3 steps process will help you to get the right answer.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And talking about your personal, day-to-day life as a Google engineer working on Gemini, how does it look like? And what, the question of productivity is very burning. We talk a lot about burns out and like how challenging and difficult it may be, So what are your secrets of staying productive?
I think part of it is sports and music, right? So
and you're also you're a sportsman, right? You're leading the rugby team at Google.
So
that's so cool.
Yeah. So I made this thing called the Google Rugby Football Club, and it was great because we had such a diverse crew. We had I just remember when we started, there was people from Ireland and France and Israel and Samoa and Tonga, and so we had this really diverse crew. But anyway, there's this funny thing where somehow, let's say during the day, if you build up a little bit of the stress, there's a strange phenomenon where sports helps you just purge the stress and come back with sort of a new frame of mind.
Yeah. So if you're stuck, you can just get refocused.
It's really interesting how that works. Yeah. And so sometimes maybe I'll come back from rugby or soccer with maybe just a solution to something that's been bugging me for hours or days. And anyway, that's kind of a magical process. The other thing is music, right? I don't know exactly what music is or why it has this effect on people, but I feel like when I'm working through some of these Bach fugues, and before that I was working on a bunch of these Beethoven sonatas. But there's this weird thing when you're working through a Bach fugue. So a Bach fugue is this thing where you have multiple voices, maybe like 3 to 4 voices interacting, where somehow every voice on its own has to be beautiful and sort of shapely. But then there's this weird thing where all of the voices have to kind of interact in a wonderful way. So somehow in your mind, you're keeping track of these 4 independent voices, but also like how they interact with one another. And for some reason, that mental exercise, whatever that is, when I come out of working through a fugue, but first of all, I'm a little bit exhausted. But second of all, for some reason, it brings this interesting clarity. Like I don't know. Like I said, I don't know exactly what music is and how it affects the human mind, but it seems to have this refreshing, kind of clarifying effect. And anyway, I'm thankful for that, even if I don't fully understand it. You know,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's,
So music and sports, that what makes
yeah.
you, keep going, and that what helps you to release stress and like so on and so forth. No, this is cool, and we're all like human beings, so we need something,
right.
to get distracted. And I don't know, sometimes when I like write an article and I struggle with, just inspiration, I just like take a walk, and it helps as well because
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
any like activity, just stimulates your brain exercise, brain activity, and so it helps you. And also another question that I wanted to ask you is about teamwork, right? Because probably you have to collaborate a lot with team members. So how does it work, especially when you're working on such a big project, like Google
Yeah.
Gemini? How do you like spread these roles? How do you see the outcomes? I don't know, rewards and achievements. How does it happen?
Wow, wow, yeah, that's such an interesting
So
question.
many questions, yeah.
So Gemini in particular, you can imagine it's a collaboration between, let's say, like research and production, and there's roughly speaking, there's researchers who's on the cutting edge, but then there's people that sort of train the model, there's people that work on the back end and the front end, and there's all these independent teams that almost like a Bach fugue, somehow they have to like work together harmoniously. And,
that's a challenge.
And it's a challenge, so, and part of it is like, part of it is just a communication challenge, and so one of the things I've learned, and I've tried to sort of touch, I've tried to touch all the different parts of Gemini. I've tried to be involved in the research and the modeling side, and the back end and the front end. And one of the things I realized is that everybody speaks a slightly different language, and so somehow to like translate between the research folks and the production folks, I want to say that's also maybe sort of a learned skill to a certain extent, and it seems to be like almost an exercise in translation, and because there's this funny thing with language though too, and I think we mentioned this earlier. It's not just the things you say; it's sort of how they say them, and there's all these interesting like social cues that are a little bit different.
Yeah.
And so I realize these different groups, they just have they have their sort of own social language, it's in their own vocabulary. So anyway, I think the communication problem is just like, so once you handle that and you have the teams harmoniously working together, I think the product arises almost like, the product's almost like an emergent phenomenon that sort of arises from the interaction of these different groups. And I guess I guess like I said, that's a little bit like the fugue. And, but anyway, it's interesting being in the thick of that. It's definitely exciting, and it doesn't really slow down. It's
Yeah. But like for
Yeah.
you personally, because when you work with multiple teams, you have different languages. I mean, if we're just like German, English, whatever, you have like diverse team, right? First, you have to deal with that. Then you have to, for example, communicate with different teams, like research, they speak one language with a different one. So this is another challenge. Plus interpersonal communication. What are the best, like maybe some really simple or practical steps that you can recommend for those who struggle with communication issues? Like, for example,
Yeah.
you should be direct or whatever. You should
yeah.
ask many questions. So what can you recommend?
What's funny is, so there's also the different communication modalities, right? So let's say there's like chat versus email versus in person or whatever.
Oh yeah, oh my gosh, I forgot about it. You have so many.
So I think there's this funny thing where chat like gets old very quickly, in the sense that, so you can be going back and forth with somebody, like maybe you have 20 or 30 exchanges about something.
Yeah.
And maybe you have a quick meeting, and literally within 30 seconds you've kind of clarified whatever it is. And I realized with a lot of these different communication media, there's a certain loss of information. So like when you and I are sitting here speaking, there's something that I can read, just maybe micro expressions on the face, or intonation. And somehow I realize all of that conveys information. And so somehow knowing when like chat has basically reached its threshold, it's saturated, when you need to move from chat to something like an in-person meeting, like that in and of itself is kind of a skill. When does maybe an email suffice, because it can be asynchronous. So, but then on the other hand, there's a little bit of a cost benefit. So if you say to somebody, listen, can we talk about this thing for a few minutes?
Yeah.
You're taking their time. You're synchronously taking their entire time, in which it kind of forces them to pay attention. So it has a high cost, but on the other hand, it also has a benefit of just the bandwidth of communication. So, yeah, somehow I guess first and foremost negotiating those modalities, and figuring out when do you escalate to in person. That sort of thing goes a long way, and then really I think it's one of those funny things where I think you have to practice, right? Somehow.
Yeah, everything comes with practice.
Yeah, literally, and I didn't used to necessarily think of that, but even somehow communicating with people and getting things across, I realized actually takes practice. It's you know, it's interesting. I for some reason I just thought language is something we're kind of born with, and we kind of, but
And I think you never
yeah.
stop learning here, right? So you've been in Google
Yeah.
like for a while, but still, like I think like every day you still can learn something new in terms
No,
of
no,
communicating with
it's true.
people, teams,
Yeah, no,
and
that's
so
really
on.
true. It's really true.
Yeah,
And
and yeah, sure, go ahead.
no, and I was just going to say at this, what's funny is we have this biweekly meetup at Google, this Gemini meetup, and that's a little bit interesting too, because I notice, you know, people come in and like they come in sometimes with legitimate problems that you know, it's either something that they're personally going through or maybe their business or whatever, and that's sort of that's kind of another form of communication because you know, anyway, sometimes it's just sometimes there's a technical solution to the problem and sometimes there's not, and anyway, it just, you know, that's another interesting one, right? So.
But now, like, you made me think whether how often people ask, for example, Google Gemini about some, you know, like really like, how do I make relationships with my husband better, and if these LLMs can actually help you with that as well.
You know, it was interesting.
I've never tried it. Yeah.
You know what? You know, sometimes they have interesting ideas, and so yeah, you know, and like I said, it was basically LLM can somehow enrich, in theory, maybe every aspect of your life, right? And but somebody came in the other day and mentioned that, you know, the transcript of Gemini, it essentially constitutes something like a diary, right? Because, you know, every day they're asking something, like you said, about, you know, maybe something related to kids or marriage or work or whatever. And sort of when they go back to their chat logs, in some sense, it's like, yeah, it's like it's like a recorded diary of their life. And anyway, that's a little bit funny to think about too. But
yeah. But you know, I also, as an experienced engineer, right, I'd like to ask you, what tips can you give to younger generation, right, to those who want to start working with AI or with large language models? So, any advice for them?
So I think first and foremost, GitHub. So essentially, let's say you're looking for a job. A lot of times what happens when we go to startups and big companies is that our code is lost in this vault, like essentially it never sees the outside world.
Yeah.
But if you can have a series of like GitHub projects that constitute kind of a resume in some sense, and maybe they actually speak louder than the resume. I think that's kind of first and foremost. And then the question is, what do you fill GitHub with? And really, you know, the trick is sometimes just sort of scratching your own itch. And if it turns out that you have some problem that you could solve with the LLM, you know what, put together a little project, do it, put it up on GitHub, and let the world see it, collaborate with it. And what happens is sometimes people will come to the Gemini meetup with some little project they've done, they'll hook up with somebody else, and then, you know, something will kind of come of that. But yeah, basically just dive in, kind of scratch your own itch, and then if possible, at the end of the day, if you can have something like a portfolio of these other different problems I've solved, like to me somehow maybe that's the best.
So it's kind of more visible. So with a project, you can highlight the skills that you have, and that can, you know, that can help you to stand out among all other people and engineers.
Right, exactly. And yeah, exactly. And so, you know, recently I hired an intern, and I remember I went through, you know, about 500 or 600, you know, applications, and I just remember looking at, you know, and some people I noticed they had a lot of projects on GitHub, and they had solved some problems that were personal, like, you know, somebody had something that like was a personal scholar, you know, and this sort of scholar assistant would go like, you know, hunt down papers and sort of, you know, and I just realized that yeah, I think maybe what separates good candidates is just this: they have a body of work, and they figured out sort of how to make LLMs work for them, and maybe that's a trick, by the way. My own intuition is somehow if you can sort of scratch your own itch, I just have a feeling that the probability of you being able to solve other problems may be greater. That's just maybe my intuition. You know.
But the only thing, you know, that worries me is that, like, probably a lot of people are working on different projects, but the market is so highly competitive. So how to stand out? It's so hard. And how even to get, you know, these people in the companies to look at you, because sometimes, you know, you just apply, you never hear back. I've heard it from many engineers that they struggle with that because just, you know, like ignorance, no one gets back to you. Any ways of, any tips here?
You know, what's funny is I think about that once in a while. I've never been able to get a job cold calling, or I've never been able to get a job like by applying to anything, actually. And the only way I've ever been able to get a job is by going to things in person.
So warm introductions or in-person communication.
Like, you know, and the crazy thing, if people happen to live in places like Silicon Valley, where there's just like every day, so if you go to something like Cerebral Valley, every day there's like 5 or 6 meetups, and you know, all throughout the city. And if you keep going to those and keep meeting people, every time you meet somebody, it's almost like playing a lottery ticket. And I feel like the probability of finding somebody who can help you land a job, like it approaches 1 as you keep talking to people. But somehow I feel like that's the most powerful way. And to people that can like actually apply to things online and land jobs that way, like kudos. But for some reason I've never.
Good luck, and we're happy for you.
Yeah, for some reason that's been hard for me.
But I actually love the idea that you mentioned events, because I personally do host and attend a lot of events, and I really see that like it's pretty effective. I didn't know if it is effective for engineers as well, so I'm really glad to hear that it's basically work for everyone, right? Because in-person communication matters.
Right, it's true. And you know, I think part of that though, there is a little bit of a bubble because we live in this like Silicon Valley kind of high density place where there's a bunch of startups. But you know, I traveled to Boston a few weeks ago to give a little talk, and I noticed the same thing there. There were a bunch of people with startups, and people are getting together and finding jobs. And so I just, my gut says that for some reason, meeting people in person is probably still maybe one of the best things. But unfortunately, you know, that requires you to be like co-located with somebody or travel, and sometimes that's like prohibitively difficult. So it's challenging. That's
yeah,
true.
no, of course.
Yeah.
And you know, the other question that I cannot avoid as I'm leading a big community of female founders and women in tech in SF. So what about female engineers, right? Because I've heard many different opinions why the area is still highly male dominated. Some people say that there are more men with the specific knowledge that are required. Some people say that not enough women apply, like we're open, but we don't get as many applications, and really different other like options. So in your opinion, how can we encourage more women to like code, or how we can help them better to integrate and find jobs? So any ideas on that?
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, I think, you know, one of the things I think is that this tends to start at home. And so I have 3 daughters, and 3 daughters, 2 sons. And
5 kids.
Yeah. And so one of the things I did with my daughters is just, you know, around the age of 4 and 5, when they could kind of learn and they could read and this and that, and they could use a computer, I just started them on Khan Academy. And so they went through the JavaScript thing, they went through the SQL thing, some Python. And in some sense to them, so one of the things I do with our kids is I teach them languages. So they've had some Greek, some Latin, some Hebrew, a little bit of Latvian, and I'm kind of thinking about German maybe next.
And that helps them to code as well,
but
right?
That's what I'm thinking. So you know, when I introduce them to code, I just like, by the way, this is another language, like, you know, like any other language. And so what I notice about my daughters is that they pick it up and they pick it up spontaneously, and they kind of have fun with it. And it's, in some sense, it's like it's not even a big deal. And let's say, you know, my 10-year-old, she happens to be a little bit better than her brother with coding. It's also not a big deal. She just happens to be good at coding or whatever. And in some sense, it's part of their environment, and they don't even think about it. And so what I'm hoping that translates into when they're adults is that they have this attitude of sort of just going for it, and just kind of being like barrier free, and just you know, not holding back, and really just going for whatever they want to do. If it happens to be in the engineering thing, that would be amazing. But I'm hoping it just gives them the freedom and the courage to like, just kind of do it. And you know, and then the funny thing is, so their grandma, my mom, she happens to be a CEO, and she, you know, my mom started, I guess she started programming, I think maybe back in the 70s when they were doing.
You
like
had a really great example in front of you, yeah.
And you know, and then so she went into biochemistry, and she started a bunch of startups. She took a company public, and but the same thing for my daughters. Like, it's just, you know, grandma takes companies public, and you know, grandma's a scientist, and that's kind of what grandmas do.
Grandma takes companies public. Great grandma.
But in some sense, like, you know, so hopefully that's also kind of just something that's in the environment, and ideally they just sort of take it for granted. You know, they just take it for granted that grandmas take companies public.
Yeah.
And that's just kind of, you know, that's just the way it is.
But
you
you're
know?
mentioning two important things
Yeah.
actually that might be part of the solution.
Yeah.
That one, you can start early, you know,
Right,
and
right.
I think one of the challenges is that people, they just don't get introduced to this. So for
Yeah.
example, I'm like, when I was a kid, nobody told me like, oh, you can actually code. So my parents were not in this sphere, so I didn't have this example, and nobody just offered me. And probably not always we think about like girls, young girls, as, you know, as programmers, right? So you don't even think maybe you should go like ice skating or dancing, so you don't necessarily think that you can learn them coding, right? And this is one thing. And the other thing is a pattern, right? So for example, you had your mom, right? Grandma is a CEO, she takes companies public. So I didn't have this pattern, for example, for me. And I think in many cases, women just don't have this example, you know, and they don't even think about that. For example, if your mom was, I don't know, like an accountant, she's like, okay, I'll follow the same path, right? But that's actually really cool, and I love the way you stated it, that it's the same as like Greek language or whatever is German language, and the way you present it, maybe it's even make it easier for them to understand. Like it's not something scary, right? It's something that you can try and learn, and just like the earlier you start, the easier would it be, right?
Yeah. No, it's absolutely true. And then the other thing too is I don't even know, I mean, teaching engineering and a thing, or programming as a thing in itself is okay. But really, like programming for me, it's always just kind of a vector or a means to solve problems. And so if my daughters are thinking about something they want to do that's fun, or they want to create a little animation and they need programming to do it, or they want to create a little game and by the way, they just need programming as another tool, like hopefully it's not even, hopefully they just get into the place where they're thinking about solving problems, and programming just happens to be another tool that they have. And so, so no, you're absolutely right. If at the end of the day, if programming is like, it's no big deal, it's just programming. Like in some sense, I know that maybe I've done my work, because it's, you know, like you said, it's not really anything privileged or strange. It's just you know, it's maybe a tool. And but you're right. But I think people tend to think of it as something a little bit scary and forbidden and inaccessible. So so yeah, if you can make programming kind of mundane and you know, non-natural and not scary, maybe that's the way to go.
And you know, the other thing I just remember about that I've heard from female software engineers, that they mentioned that very often when they go to meetups full of male representatives, sometimes they feel awkward, as, you know, like male representatives look at them like, oh, you really know how to code? Are you sure? So, and this is, you know, this confidence issue. How to overcome it, or how to, you know, like for example, let's say I'm good at coding, and I come to you and you're saying, you know, like 4 guys, you know, talking about coding. How should I, you know, like interact with you from a stronger side, you know?
Oh, that's really interesting. You know, so at the meetup that we run at Google, so we have a lot of women that come in, and
that's great.
But you know, in terms of the audience, though, they tend to be the most competent. They ask the best questions. They have the best ideas. A lot of them are doing startups.
Interesting.
And for some reason, when they come in the room, they hold their own. And somehow it's like, you know, actually they're speaking, and people are listening. It's kind of the opposite. It's sort of like people kind of gathering around them, and it's an interesting dynamic. And you're right. Somehow, maybe when they come in, they exude this interesting natural confidence, and my sense is because sometimes they're actually like solving problems, and you know, the interesting thing is a problem, and by the way, here's how I solved it, and you know, and you're right, and I don't know exactly what the secret sauce is for that. It's kind of like, I mean, it's easy to go away and tell somebody, hey, be confident.
That's
difficult, right? That's difficult.
Yeah.
You know, and but I often, you know, and I wonder if it's one of those things where, so when the pandemic hit, like I said, and so when the pandemic hit, we couldn't play rugby for like a couple of years.
Yeah.
And one of the things I had to do was I had to learn all these new sports. So I ended up learning like soccer and basketball, frisbee, a bunch of these crazy things. And I remember when I stepped on the field, I was basically every day I was a fool. Like I was literally just I had to get used to that strange, uncomfortable thing. And then at some point, just by like going again and again and again, at some point I became confident and I could sort of hang. But I just wonder in those cases whether you just keep at it, and I wonder if you just keep going in some sense, and then and maybe after you've tried enough, maybe eventually you arrive. And but I wonder if it's one of those things where you have to be in the game, and you have to show up, and you have to play, and you know.
Yeah, but basically you're saying that confidence is also a skill that can be trained, and I 100% agree with you. And you know, I also love saying that, like today, you're a fool, yeah, like, or you know nothing, but
Right.
tomorrow you're the best. Today you're the worst, tomorrow you're the best. So, and it all comes with training. So that's why I really love your point about saying that you try something new and you feel really awkward, but then, and you know, like my daughter she goes to ice skating. I'm stereotypical, so she's not coding, she goes to ice skating. But I see a lot of people, you know, like older age, even like from 3 to 65 who are
Wow.
trying something new. So they just came to ice skating and they tried from scratch, and obviously they fall down, they look awkward, funny, they feel stupid, but the way that they keep going, and then you see like 2 weeks ago, like this, you know, guy was so bad, and now you see that he's like super cool, he's the best, and this is amazing. So, and this is to your point that you just have to keep going, you have to keep trying, and so on and so forth. And you know, one more thing I wanted to ask you is about your personal experience working on Google Gemini and on Google in general. So what was the most unexpected thing for you as a, you know, like working here, working on your project? What was the most challenging and what was the most rewarding or memorable? So 3 things: unexpected, challenging, the most rewarding.
And you know, so part of Bard, I guess I came from the assistant, and so it went kind of assistant, Bard, and then Gemini. And so one of the things with the assistant is we were working with much smaller models, and to a certain extent we had to do like a lot of work. And so if you can imagine, you have this huge kind of elaborate infrastructure with kind of a small model in the middle, like, you know, but this huge elaborate infrastructure did all the magic.
Yeah.
The funny thing is, when you go to LLMs, all of a sudden the LLMs can orchestrate themselves, and what that means is, like, let's say you're trying to plan a trip to Tokyo, and it's relatively complicated in the sense that you need flights and hotels and cars.
Exactly.
And by the way, you want an itinerary, and you know, maybe you just want some YouTube videos about what it's like in Kyoto and whatever. So you can imagine there's this relatively kind of complex journey, let's say, and it turns out if you tell the LLM, by the way, you have these tools available. You have kind of a flights tool and a hotels tool and a YouTube tool. Just go off and work your magic and essentially come up with an itinerary for this person and a ticket they can buy. The LLM will actually know, oh wow, okay, I better call YouTube, I better call flights, and here's what happened, and I'm going to package this up in a really nice way for the user. So the LLM can somehow like do all that work, and that was both surprising and difficult, because you know, we were coming from this model where in some sense we do all the work, and then the LLM is just, or the model is just kind of not an afterthought, but it's just like we have this entire elaborate infrastructure to the point where the LLM can really make a bunch of these decisions. So that was challenging in the sense that really had to rethink kind of my entire mindset. Figure out, by the way, how to like harness the LLM, because the LLM, it's interesting because it's creative, but it's a little bit unpredictable.
Yeah.
And so
that was the most challenging thing, right?
Right. Exactly. And but the fact that the LLM was capable in some sense of orchestrating itself was like just really surprising. So, and you know, to me, working with LLMs every day, there's always just some new like emergent phenomenon that just sort of blows me away. And so no, I'm really thankful to kind of be in this space.
Yeah.
And
so that was the most challenging thing, and what was the most memorable out of all your experience?
Oh, you know, the most memorable was, let's see, you know, I think this was, you know, really, this was really early on, you know, when we were, this is probably in like, maybe late 2022, early 2023. And so this is when we were kind of, you know, the LLM thing was new, we were experimenting with it. And I would just, I was shocked that, for instance, you know, I was just having the LLM do all these crazy things and like composing music, and I was shocked that, for instance, you know, I asked the LLM at this, I needed a presentation, and I remember asking the LLM at that point, listen, can you write a few slides and can you put this thing together? And somehow it just seemed to magically kind of know what I wanted, and this was like way back when, you know, LLMs are kind of like brand new to us, and anyway, that to me was kind of magical. And I guess that sort of set me off on this journey, and but yeah, it's and I feel like, you know, like you mentioned, every day there's some new challenge, and I feel like and here's the other crazy thing about the LLMs in general, things are moving so quickly, right?
Yes.
And so like every 2 weeks when we have one of these meetups,
I think this
at Google,
is so challenging, honestly.
That's the crazy thing, right? So every 2 weeks when we have something at Google, like something new has happened within that span.
Yeah.
And like I think it used to be back in the day, you could think in terms of months or sometimes even quarters. But like things are happening quickly, and I think that's one of the challenges too. Is how do we sort of move with that kind of velocity, but also at the same time like do interesting things, do things that scratch people's itches. But how do we also move quickly or whatever? Right? That's really difficult. And so I think that's also been one of the things. But that's why I'm kind of grateful, like you mentioned, to be plugged into, like I'm grateful to actually be able to meet people in person and talk about these things, because there's this funny thing where I feel like that's actually where I learn things. And occasionally I'll come across something maybe on LinkedIn or whatever, but it's really talking to people, figuring out what problems they're trying to solve. And every once in a while, if I'm talking to somebody at kind of the meetup, they'll drop like a little gem or something, and it's this crazy thing where you have to somehow be attentive, and you have to be open to. But somebody will just mention some problem that they're having, or maybe they're I don't know, maybe they're trying to like do day trading, or maybe they want to like talk to Sherlock Holmes, or just they have these little problems, and somehow. Anyway, somehow I just feel like you have to be open and you have to be listening, and you see these little things.
Yeah, and I guess you never know, right? You never know what problem they're trying to solve.
Exactly.
But just like, I just wanted to I have a follow-up question here, wrapping up all our conversations. I have two more for you, and one is like, what are the most interesting use cases that you've seen, from the users, the way they use Google Gemini, and maybe some of the things that you can encourage people to try, not only tech people, but just regular people. Obviously, we do it like to check grammar, to like to write a code. What else? Like something maybe simple but interesting.
Yeah, so I don't know if this is simple, but I was giving a little talk yesterday up in San Mateo, and so I talked to this concert pianist who is using he's using Gemini to compose music in the style of like Chopin, Bach, Beethoven, and then somehow perform the music, and then also performs the music with like these various robots, and then so she synthesizes these kind of beautiful things. But somehow the idea of like composing music, playing music, somehow this like, anyway, that kind of blew me away. And
I actually didn't know that like art people use it. This is so cool. I mean they do obviously, but like on a regular basis.
I think this is a little bit cutting edge, but one of the things she did too is she trained somehow the model to respond like Chopin or Beethoven, and so people can ask questions and that sort of thing. But one of the questions I had is that let's say you have a Chopin or Beethoven or Bach or whatever composing music, like in some sense they know what the human hand feels like, and so when they're composing music, at least like subconsciously they have this human physiology in mind. In other words, they write things usually that are sort of playable and they feel good under the hands. And I said, when you play music from an LLM, like, does it feel like a human wrote it? Is it playable or whatever?
Yeah, because you have to put the hands in a certain position.
Precisely, and she mentioned that occasionally LLM would write something that was like just literally physically unplayable. Like, I don't know if you need 11 fingers or whatever.
Yeah, so use your feet.
Use your third hand. So, but she mentioned for the most part, like this music was kind of playable. And anyway, I just thought that was kind of fascinating, and that's also one of these kind of co-evolution things I was talking about. And then in terms of everyday.
Yeah, everyday.
I mean, it just shocks me that when people are looking for jobs, for instance, they'll have help just crafting a resume, a cover letter that's specific for this job. But one of the other things I noticed too is that so I think there was this movie Dune came out or whatever a few months ago.
Yeah.
And so there was somebody who I think had read the books a long time ago and wanted to know what's the movie doing. So somehow ended up putting both the Dune novels and the script in, and saying, hey, by the way, what's the difference between these two things? What do they do? And between the book and the movie or whatever, because usually that the movie's a little bit different. And so that was something, and literally Gemini came up with, this thing's in the book, it's not in the movie. Oh, they made up this thing or whatever, and they put it in. And so anyway, I felt like that was kind of an interesting,
It is actually. I've never thought of that. I would definitely try asking. And just like the last question. So in terms of AI in general, talking, right? So how do you see it evolving in 5-10 years? And what are maybe the spheres, I don't know, fintech, health tech, whatever, that can benefit the most out of using AI for humanity, for the world in general?
Oh yeah, that's so tough. And so one of the difficult things sometimes is just the latency of the LLM. And so one of the experiments I did was I thought, can we use Gemini for things like day trading and this and that? But it turns out that, let's say, if you need to do things in the fintech space, sometimes you really need to operate it like this. You need to make these microtransactions that are really fast. But it turns out that LLMs are good at processing a bunch of information. So imagine if you take like a bunch of documents and thousands of pages of like 10 Qs or whatever they call it, and and then maybe some output from some models. It's possible that the LLM could synthesize something like a large trading strategy. And I noticed when I was trying to do like LLM with games, that's the other thing too, is that maybe the LLM can craft something like a general strategy for StarCraft or for chess or whatever, and then you have other models that come in and sort of actually manipulate the game sort of in real time, and maybe the LLM is in this kind of large advisory role. And so maybe it's a case, I mean, obviously LLMs are going to get better with respect to latency, but maybe it's a case that they come in these kind of, with these large scale roles, but maybe you have a place for these smaller models that are still operating in real time and that kind of thing. And so it's possible that the space of the models bifurcates to a certain extent, where you have like large models doing really sort of difficult things, really like large scale things, and you have small quick models sort of doing like real time things.
Yeah.
And I wonder if the future is going to be these two things collaborating to do maybe new things that we can't anticipate.
But I guess this is the most beautiful synergy if we can find the way for the most productive engagements between human and AI, right?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And and it's one of those things, Dasha. I think it's a little bit of an emerging phenomenon. I have a feeling we don't know exactly how things are going to work. And I guess what I find fascinating is this coevolution that we're doing with LLMs. Like, it's not where LLMs are going to be in 5 and 10 years, but it's where's humanity going to be in 5 or 10 years, possibly as a result of like co-evolving with these things.
Exactly.
So maybe where's humanity going to be in 5 to 10 years? Maybe that's even more interesting, right? And LLM just happens to be the tool to sort of get us there.
So let's see what the future holds for us.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Peter. It was
Dasha.
such a great
Yeah,
discussion.
thank you so
I really
much.
enjoyed
appreciate
it.
that.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you for having me. So let's see. So I asked Gemini to come up with a little song for the Dasha podcast, and so let's see what it came up with. So I don't know. Do you want to try to sing it together? Or not?
Yeah, like you can start, I will repeat it. Okay, let's
so
do
let's
it.
so let's see. So the first one is Talks with Dasha on Gemini We Flow.
Talks with Dasha on Gemini we flow.
Tech trends and startups
And knowledge we
will
grow. Woo! High five, great job.
That's amazing.
Thank you.
That's amazing.